Japanese concentration camps rose up during World War II and served as prisoner of war camps for soldiers and those involved with the work of the Allies. Although some were more notoriously noted over others, they eventually housed about 140,000 white prisoners, at all of which at least 1 in 3 died of starvation, disease, punishment, or exhaustion from overwork. The Japanese defied the terms of the Third Geneva Convention of 1929, which was created to guarantee all prisoners of war general provisions and protection during capture. They ignored the terms further, forcing prisoners to live in confinement and do dangerous labor. With about 175 prisoner of war camps in Japan itself, the Japanese concentration camps had one of the most devastating conditions of those used throughout the world during World War II.
Like many nations involved in World War II, the Japanese had their own concentration camps for prisoners and other detainees throughout Asia. However, Japan was their biggest base for prisoners of war and undoubtedly the home of more notorious camps in all of Asia. The Japanese prisoner of war camps opened in Japan in different dates throughout the war. The Japanese ignore the terms of the Geneva Convention of 1929, believing that those who were captured were to be shamed and more fit for punishment rather than dealt with reasonable justice. This, in turn, created the Japanese concentration camps one of the most inhumane in the war.
At all camps, disease, hunger, and lack of resources were all too common for all prisoners of war. At many camps, little water was provided for the hundreds or thousands of prisoners. Many would wait for hours at a time just to fill a small canteen with dirty water. Rivers or other bodies of water would often be dirty enough to spread dysentery, killing thousands in a matter of weeks. A more advanced type of dysentery, called amoebic dysentery, would cause ulcers, abdominal pain, and severe diarrhea. There was little to no treatment for disease in the camps. For nutrition, most prisoners received a daily average of about 600 calories a day. Still, they were expected to work 12 hours a day, most often in mines, shipyards, and factories on a minuscule diet of grains, vegetables, and meat or fish. Food often had rocks, rat droppings, and maggots on them. The prisoners' diet lacked nutrition, sometimes causing beriberi, which included exhaustion, diarrhea, numbness, or pellagra, which resulted in skin lesions and mental disorders. Most prisoners had to turn to extreme measures, eating snakes, dogs, earthworms, or lizards to sustain their nutrition. For burials, the Japanese dug deep, wide trenches in the ground and assigned the prisoners to organize and pack the dead in the trenches. The smell of the decomposing bodies was so foul that many had to wear masks to protect themselves. As some bodies inflated, they would rise to the top of the ground, and wild animals would come and take the body parts for themselves. The Japanese did not provide its prisoners with Red Cross packages, which were usually made up of medicine, blankets, food, nutrition, and mail from home. The Japanese used this tactic as a way to decrease morale and sometimes stole the packages and used it for themselves.
We are now going in a little closer to one man in particular, who goes by the name of Louie Zamperini.
That's right. Louie Zamperini was known for his amazing running during the Olympics that were held in Berlin, but also for his amazing survival in some of Japan's worst concentration camps.
Louie was flying in a plane known as the Green Hornet when an engine blew out. They landed into the ocean, and for 47 days, Zamperini and 2 other men cooked imaginary meals for each other, avoided being bombed on by overhead Japanese planes, and had to avoid being eaten by sharks. A Japanese ship near the shore picked up the Olympic runner, who had then turned into a 79-pound man.
But it wasn't over yet, Carson. When Louie was picked up, he was sent to the detention building in Kwajalein, where Zamperini said they were beaten every day. They had to eat rice infested with bugs, and for living corridors, they were allowed an 8-foot deep hole carved from coral.
We are now going to Louie Zamperini's house for an interview and more stories on his infamous captor, the bird.
We are now here with Mr. Zamperini's lovely house. Can you tell me how difficult it was to survive out on the ocean?
It was very challenging. Every day we didn't know if it was going to be our last. Whether it was from the sharks constantly swimming around our raft, the Japanese planes flying overhead, or even just losing the will to live. Every day was a struggle, but we had to pass the time. So some common things I did for the other men was cooking for them to keep them hopeful that one day they would get one of those meals. But we also sang a lot of Bing Crosby songs.
When you went to the first location, the detention center, what was your impression?
Detention center? What detention center? The soldiers who were there before me dubbed it Execution Island. The conditions there were so bad that most of the men didn't last much more than a month. I remember one instance in particular. The guards had told me to do push-ups, so I got down and started doing push-ups. They said, no, over there, and pointed to a toilet. So I walked over to the toilet with my head facing it. Every time I went down, they would push my head into the toilet and laugh. They also broke my nose 3 times when they had figured out that I was an athlete. No, that wasn't a detention center. That was too nice of a word for that place.
Is that all the horrible things they did to you at that location?
No. On one other location, I remember we walked out in front of a bunch of doctors who had syringes filled with some mysterious green goo. Said, tell us everything you feel. So I said, I'm feeling dizzy. Then later, now I'm feeling itchy. And still later, I said I felt like I would pass out. That day I had been injected in me 3 times. Later in the week we found out, me and Phillips, that we were going to be executed. Luckily they found out that I was an Olympic athlete and decided to send me to another camp to make some propaganda radio broadcasts to America.
In the Japanese culture, it's a great dishonor to be captured or to surrender. Do you feel that this was true in your experiences with the Japanese officers?
Yeah. The Japanese guards believed that I wasn't actually human, that I was disgraceful because I was captured, and that I should be abused for that reason.
Who was your worst captor, and what sort of hardships would you undergo under his rule?
I do remember one man. That was at one Japanese POW camp in Omari. His name was Muchiro Watanabe, but most of the men knew him as the Bird. If I looked away from his eyes, he would punch me for looking away. If I stared at his eyes, he'd punch me for staring at his eyes. Every day he did something to me, and it was a brutal life. He hit me over the head with a big, probably 2-pound steel buckle and cracked my skull. He'd give me a paper towel or something to wipe the blood and says, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I thought, well, he can't be so bad after all. So I wiped the blood off and stood up, and then he hit me again.
Oh, thank you so much for your time. And we now report back to you, Carson.
Thank you. That was Louie Zamperini, the man who has lived history by shaking Adolf's hand at the Berlin Olympics, fighting for the United States Air Force, earning 7 medals, living through Japan's harshest of POW camps and guards, and carried the Olympic torch in the Nagano Olympics of 1998.
Since then, Zamperini has forgiven his captors by traveling to Japan twice, and has sent forgiveness letters to the Bird, but is unsure if he received them.
What an incredible story and an incredible man. Thank you, Louie, and join us next week for Behind the Scenes of Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you, and see you soon.
As we can see, the Japanese POW concentration camps used by the Japanese during World War II were among the harshest in the war. The Japanese did not display any mercy because they refused to show kindness to those that they considered cowardly, to those who surrendered in shame during war. The result of their attitude devastated thousands upon thousands of Allied prisoners, wiping them out through disease, hunger, physical beatings, and humiliation. Although these prison camps set up by the Japanese government do not reflect the nature of most Japanese, they do reflect the worst that is brought out of human nature when a group is greedy for power and results of success over a certain people. The short-term effect that the Japanese POW camps had on society was the great loss of men that were tortured and punished to death. They were all individuals, all irreplaceable. Many of them were wiped out at the hands of the Japanese officers because of their standard of nobility and death. It was a systematic killing that wiped out soldiers in the cruelest ways possible. The major long-term effect of the Japanese POW camps is the belief of humane treatment of all people that is embodied by many cultures today. After the brutal mistreatment of the hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war during World War II, the world stepped in and bowed, never again. The philosophy of humane treatment symbolized the new era for the world, because as long as humans have existed, cruel and unusual punishment has been accepted.